One, go.
Hello and welcome to another amazing webinar part of the SWACON series, jointly hosted by the Swatantrata Center and the South Asia Students for Liberty. Today's conversation is very interesting and it's very relevant compared to the present scenario that we are facing in the world today. Here to speak with us today on liberalism beyond economics is Dr. Christopher Gohl. He has an immense knowledge both in terms of academia and polity, and he has been working as a federal ombudsman at the FDP party in Germany and is a researcher and teacher at the Welterthos Institute. He received his PhD degree in political theory from the University of Potsdam, and he holds a master's degree in American Studies and Jewish Studies. In terms of his research focuses, he works on epistemology, genesis, and prevalence of values on a pragmatic understanding of business ethics and global ethics. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Christopher Gohl, and we look forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm excited to partake in a discussion and in your search for to advance liberalism in India. I'm very impressed with what I've seen so far, and I'm really happy to be able to talk to you and join you in a discussion. I've proposed that I show you a little bit of a presentation that I prepared, and you should be able to see it online here now, Liberalism Beyond Economics. If you give me a sign that you can see it, is that okay? Yeah, okay. Liberalism Beyond Economics. First of all, a little bit something about me. I'm a father of three. It's important to my heart. I'm at the Welterthos Institute, as you said, in Germany, Tübingen, Germany. I was head of strategy at the Free Democrats in 2011, 2012. That was within the party headquarters in Berlin. I've since served as the ombudsperson, that is a person of trust within the party, and as chairman of the Commission on Freedom and Ethics of my party. I've also been privileged to be a part of manifesto processes internationally. One is the Liberal International Manifesto, the Andorra Manifesto, which we resolved in 2017, and the other, the ALDE Manifesto of the European Liberal Parties for the election in 2019. And I was partook in both debates, exciting debates, because they brought to the forefront a dialogue that we have among liberal movements and parties in Europe and in the world about the agenda of liberalism for the future. And it was a discussion that I cherish and that I feel that we're taking part in today. So let me share a little bit about my contributions to these discussions, and you may find them if you read those manifestos. You may find the traces of those. First of all, let me start with Nelson Mandela and a quotation which I very much like. To be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. And what I like about this quotation is really that it highlights that freedom is an achievement for each other, with each other. It is something that we need to cultivate, something that we need to work for, that we need to care for, something that is never wholly won. Even if we can institutionalize it in a bit, it's always a fragile project, and it needs the good people of every conviction that they partake in that project and that they advance freedom for each other, with each other. It's also about, reminds me of a quotation by Mahatma Gandhi: the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. There's something about reciprocity here. We can only live in freedom if others live in freedom. And by highlighting that, I would also like to take a critical stand against an individualism that sees us only as doing no harm. Not doing harm against others, not infringing on the freedom of others I don't think is enough. I don't think is enough for the 21st century. We need to not only let others live in peace. That is a precondition, but we also need to look out after one another. We need to create conditions for human flourishing. And from what I can see in your own priorities, you speak on your homepage about lifting barriers to human flourishing. Everyone is free to lead a decent life with dignity. That is exactly, I think, what is at stake. Everyone should be able to live a decent life with dignity, and that requires us to reciprocate, to work together with one another towards freedom for all. So if I have the liberal project creating conditions for human flourishing, it starts, of course, with the freedom of every human being as the purpose and the principle of human progress. The purpose and the principle means there's a liberal method. It's about both the purpose and the means. The organizing means of human progress is freedom. Freedom is not just the purpose, it is also the means to achieve freedom for all, which is the telos, the hope of human progress. We recognize, I think globally, liberalism recognizes the inherent dignity of every human being. We are translating that dignity into law, into the equal right to a life in self-determination. And we embrace the diversity among all members of the human family that is a natural result of everyone living his or her own life. So I think all of this goes together. We recognize the inherent dignity. We secure the right to be yourself, to be different. And we realize that that makes for diversity in our societies. And that diversity, of course, then needs to be re-regulated in a sense so that we can all live in diversity together. And that brings me to two important notions. We have the individual, but we also have the institutions, the right of law. I have here a picture of the Capitol and then the Supreme Court in the background, securing these rights. And we also have, of course, on a level between the institutions and the individuals, a level, the meso level, so to speak, not the macro, not the micro level, but the meso level of interactions of society where we live together and where we're diverse. As liberals, we commit ourselves to the cultivation of free society through free means. Again, that is the liberal method, right? We have the purpose is to create free societies where all people can live in freedom together. And we do that not with illiberal means, we do that with liberal means. We do that with means of freedom, with an action that respects and is an expression of a consummation of the freedom of individuals. For example, dialogue, I think, is freedom put to practice. It is people are participating as free and equal participants in a dialogue. They're free to leave. They are important contributors to a dialogue. So a dialogue understood as an interaction of free and equal people, I think is freedom put to practice, is a liberal method. So is competition, if it is fair competition is a liberal means. The rule of law is a liberal means. Self-determination, voluntary action, all these are liberal means. And I think that's how we cultivate free societies. What is not a liberal means, possibly, and here I have my problems, as I will highlight a little later, is if we have a technocratic rule of law. Now, often liberals, if they forget about the political dimension of freedom, they are prone to say, well, experts know best and technocrats know best and we know best, and people, will only lose freedom if left to their own devices. I think it's not so easy. I don't think that's a liberal means, technocratic government. And to cultivate those societies also means, of course, that they are in relation to one another, that the institutions, the rights of rule of law and of democracy really protect the individual, her conscience, and her building of character. And I think while we're strong in the institutional competence as liberals, and while we speak as if self-understood about the individual, I think we have somewhat forgotten that issues of virtue, issues of conscience, issues of character are of liberal import, are of liberal are on the liberal agenda. We can't prescribe this. This is something that has to develop individually, and it has to grow maybe in the family. I don't know, with good examples. But I think it's important that we realize that as liberals, we have a stake in everyone being able to live her own life responsibly with a conscience and develop a good character that is compatible with living in freedom with others. And of course, what we oftentimes forget, I feel, is this middle ground of interaction, associations, public morals. Many times, or oftentimes, liberals argue that morals are not of importance for liberals, that we should not care about morals, and often they forget to look after the political freedom of association and of publics. Because we prize economic freedom, we achieve economic freedom through the rule of law. And so we have a liberalism that is a liberalism of rights and rules, and not so much a liberalism of democratic learning, of democracy, of the political freedom. I sometimes fear we have a liberalism that stakes more importance on the claim to the rule of law and freedom, and they're very important, they're foundational, I give you that. And on economic freedom, on the other hand, the two go together, of course. And again, I'm all for economic freedom. It promises liberation from want, from needs, right? So it's a very important type of freedom. But I think what we oftentimes forget is political freedom, is cultural freedom, is what has to do with associations with public and morals. And so I think we do not only need to protect liberal constitutions and the rule of law as determined by all, and it's important that determined by all is the democratic determination, right? So all of those institutions that you see up in the left corner, they are important, but we also need to promote opportunities for everyone, which is a policy, right? The protection of orders is a polity question. The promotion of opportunities is a policies question. And then I think we need to pursue a culture built on the responsible use of freedom, a shared culture that goes along with the liberal project. And again, I think that culture is too often forgotten by liberals. We tend to care about the institutions. We tend to take for granted that individuals can make good use of their own freedom, that they develop conscience and character somehow beyond the liberal care. And oftentimes that's true if people have the luck of growing up in a household, in a family where they're taught to develop conscience and their character. But I think it is something in a Republican sense. We don't need to know all the things you do as an individual, but we need to ensure that you are able to be a citizen, that you can be a politically responsible participant in our common affairs. And so if these three fields are three fields of agenda for liberals, the protection through the rule of law and through the constitutions of liberty, the promotion of opportunities through policies, and the politics of a shared culture of responsible freedom, I think then we can help and create conditions where human creativity flourishes and where progress toward a peaceful, prosperous, and open global civil society is possible, where everyone is free, as you say, to lead a decent life with dignity. Let me just note some of the authors here that I think one should read. First of all, I'm immensely impressed with Amartya Sen. Germany is starting to notice him finally, more than 20 years after his Nobel Prize for Economics. He has received this year, or will receive later this year, the most prestigious prize that Germany can offer. It is the Peace Prize of our German bookstores. For some reason, they have this highly prestigious award, and it is awarded this year to Amartya Sen for his work. Freedom as a method, free means for purposes of freedom, I'm looking to Amartya Sen for a lot of guidance in the work that we do at my institute, at the Global Ethic Institute. Amartya Sen, to me, is the living embodiment with his capability approach for how we should think about liberalism, creating conditions for human flourishing. Of course, that goes back to moral philosophers, actually, Kant and Adam Smith. We see down there John Stuart Mill and Helen Taylor, the daughter of Harriet Taylor, his wife. So it's his stepdaughter, actually. And he used to work with her. They used to work on issues of individual emancipation. Then we have on another side, maybe you will recognize only one or two of them. It is, of course, Mises, Hayek, and then two German liberals that you may or may not know, Röpke and Eucken, the fathers of ordo-liberalism, the type of liberalism that was most strongly involved in arguing for the rights and the rule of law and an economic constitution of liberty. So I think they are important. I think we need them both. We need the ordo-liberals, but I think the ordo-liberals, again, as I said, it's not enough. We need to look towards the political conditions of freedom. So Tocqueville, seen here next to Adam Smith. Tocqueville is a good, I think, introduction to political sociology, to think about what it requires a society to be free. There's a young Hannah Arendt below Tocqueville, and on the left to Amartya Sen. Hannah Arendt, of course, being a proponent of political liberalism, a strong sense, a strong understanding of the importance of and the distinction between liberation and freedom. Liberation being the process that we have in revolution, that we free ourselves from oppressive systems, but then we need to secure freedom, then we need to gain freedom. And that is not only through our institutions, but it's also about through the customs, through the procedures that we work with one another, through the public morals, through, let's say, civic virtues. And then I have John Dewey here on the right-hand side of Amartya Sen, one of the strongest proponents, I think, of freedom as method, freedom as a method of intelligence, he says. And he agrees with others that only by participating in the common intelligence and sharing in the common purpose as it works for the common good can individual human beings realize their true individualities and become truly free. So it's an idea that our individual liberty is bound up in the liberty of others, and we need to strive together to create conditions together for freedom for all. So freedom with each other, freedom for each other. And I'll conclude with two more thinkers here. Judith Shklar, the one strong on the Constitution of Liberty, who said liberalism in an answer to a liberalism, or it's a liberalism of fear, is an answer to cruelty, right? We need to avoid cruelty. To be liberal means to avoid cruelty, and we need a strong type of constitutional setup. But I think she's relevant again to reread, very interesting, very insightful, as well as Sheila Ben Habib, a cosmopolitan thinker, really, I think, which carries the liberal torch into the future. So I recommend reading her. And I recommend, I'll close with that, that's my last slide, by recommending this book here by a friend of mine, actually, the founder of the institute that I work with. His name is Klaus Dirksmeyer. He's a philosopher in Germany, a liberal philosopher, used to work in the US. He's written this wonderful book, Qualitative Freedom, Autonomy and Cosmopolitan Responsibility. And you'll find his reference, you will find him very much a student, let's say, of Amartya Sen, or a promoter of Amartya Sen. And he traces back Sen's liberalism through Kant. And then a second man, which you're likely not recognizing, the second man on the left-hand side, that smiley beard, like a hipster today. He is Karl Christian Friedrich Krause, a very unknown German idealist, who is virtually unknown except for a few philosophers in the German tradition. but very much known in South America. He was a bad writer, but he had good translators, and he actually had students, or he was a difficult writer, let's put it this way. He was a difficult writer, and he had good translators who translated into Spanish and made sense of his comprehensive liberalism. And again, he employed liberalism, or he described liberalism as a liberal method to achieve purposes of freedom through means of freedom. And his very convincing, beautiful liberalism that he offers, Carl Christian Friedrich Krause. And a good introduction is if you go and download, I made you a tinyurl.com here. If you download, you can directly download it for free, this book. And please not only download it and read it and download it, but also read this book. He also talks about Hayek. I think he tries to secure or to help Hayek from some of the misunderstandings of Hayek. He's basically appreciative of Hayek, but also critical of some of what he would say are faults in thinking at Hayek, or not consequential thinking by Hayek. And of course, you'll find a portrait of Amartya Sen. So I'll leave that up, The Liberal Project, Creating Conditions for Human Flourishing. I recommend this book as a means to extend our own conversation beyond this conversation. And just for the record, this is my email address. I'm happy, of course, to take up the conversation with you even after our conversation today. So thanks a lot. That's only almost 20 minutes that I've talked now, and I think it's time to go back on us to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gohl. In fact, this was and indeed a very comprehensive and inclusive idea of the Liberal Project, given the many thinkers that I could see, where in the contemporary parlance, you'll see there's always a tussle between adherents of both Amartya Sen and Hayek, sort of, if you put it that way. My question, the first question before we go to the audience, is that you talked about Hayek and how he has been sort of misinterpreted in many ways. I came across this idea of rule of law where Hayek talks about consensus between citizens and individuals of the society as a precursor to realizing rule of law. How do you see that in terms of that shared culture of freedom that you talk about?
I'm myself no expert on Hayek. I think what is unfortunate is, or the critique that I would support is, I think Hayek often seems to make strong a freedom that is understood negatively, right? And I am no friend of the distinction between negative and positive freedom, because I think it's misleading. I think any negative freedom has a positive core, and any positive freedom needs protection in a negative sense against infringement. So I think rather positive and negative aspects are ways of looking at freedoms that describe, certain necessities, certain qualities of freedom. But here we are. I think we should discuss the qualities of freedom. We should ask whose freedom and which freedom. And I think that, or my impression is that Hayek and others, the neoliberals, they were more concerned with building a law that serves liberty than in determining what that law should entail, or what the policies are that should follow. So again, this is an immensely important project, and no one should belittle it. I think it's highly important that we have an order of freedom, not only in the economic realm, but also I think to have rights, to have basic liberties, to have civil liberties. That is an achievement that needs to be secured, and the rule of law oftentimes is an enabler, empowers us to have a democracy within that rule of law. So I'm all for that, but I'm also for being interested and being invested in organizing, the procedures of public dialogue, of coming together, and of determining, what we should write into law and what we should not write into law, what we should expect from one another, not by virtue of law, but by virtue of being citizens with one another, and what we should do in policies. So I think Hayek, gives us strength in one realm. We should just not confuse it. And I'm saying this because I feel that sometimes, libertarians are more about the rule of law, and they take their cues from Hayek. And Hayek certainly, he had civic impulses, civic intuitions. It doesn't always show, I think, in the way he translates it into an economic agenda, but he certainly was more of a political liberal than becomes apparent, I think, in a systematic project.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gohl. The other question that we have is this presumption of the chicken and egg approach. So sort of people would say that markets are themselves a force that induce freedom within the culture of a society. However, there are others who argue as a culture of freedom as a precursor to realizing a free market society. So what do you have to say about this tussle? Because therein lies the essential difference between the adherents of sort of Hayek and Amartya Sen in that matter.
I would say that it is not something that is distinguished, but actually I think the market is part of the culture of freedom. And the culture of freedom is in essence embodied in a fair market, right? Culture is also more than the market, but I think that if we try to divide it and say we have to decide between the culture and we have to decide between the market, then I think we're going wrong. I think that what's important in the market is what the ordo liberals said. You need to have a fair competition and a fair start so you can partake in the competition. And that itself is an achievement that we need to work for. And they proposed that we have the rule of law, of course, the constitution of liberty that secures that type of the rights to participate fairly. They also looked after the how do I say this? What's the English word? They tried to crush economic power, right? They were concerned with the problem of economic power and the concentration, especially of economic power. So they crushed monopolies. They had a vision of a decentralized, really economy, maybe of small scale, even some of them, where people were active economic participants. And I think that's a vision that connects them and Amartya Sen. As a matter of fact, they are looking out, or they're working towards connecting ordoliberalism and Amartya Sen these days. So it's a very important conversation. Maybe we can follow up on that another time. But I think that's to understand the market itself as a product of culture is helpful. For us in Europe, Europeans are wondering whether the way German liberals understand the market is not deeply Protestant, right? Whether it's not a religious way of understanding the market. Whereas, German liberals often tend to say, why the market is the market is the market. It's the economic self-interested man looking out for himself. And they're not realizing that really there are a lot of cultural preconceptions that feed into that notion of someone looking out for her own self. So in the end, I think there is no pure market. I think there's only market in the forms of culture. And of course, what we need to do and what we need to achieve is to make markets the benefits and the mechanisms, the principles of markets, to translate that within our own culture and encourage, the free enterprise, encourage the exchange, the open exchange of goods, encourage that you can live by doing good work, by offering good work to others. So I think there are lots of market benefits, but we need to, I think, translate them into cultural equivalents and explain them, not the way that Hayek or some of the Chicago people or German older liberals understood it and put it into words, but sort of build it, restate it in the language that is understood by local cultures.
Interesting. Thanks a lot for that. We have another question from our audience, and the question is that liberalism seems to clash with some cultural notions of family and seeks to promote individualism. And what is your view on this clash?
I think it's true. Not necessarily, because there are different liberalisms, but the dominant liberalism I think that we see, and I'm speaking now for the West, I'm speaking for Germany, I'm speaking for the United States, certainly for the United States, but also for Germany. I think we sometimes confuse individualism with liberalism. And while I think that liberalism is the go-to philosophy, the political philosophy that you need to have if you're an individualist, right? You rely on liberalism. I think liberalism is more than just political individualism. I mean, if there's any such thing as political liberalism, individualism means you're focusing on yourself, you're focusing on being who you are, and liberalism is about is a political project of helping people get along when they want to be individuals. But so it also makes requirements of individuals. It asks them to, to be good citizens, to participate in building conditions where everyone can be individual. And by that, liberalism also makes demands on individuals. And I think what's important here is those demands need not be only by the government, also by the government. We require people to pay taxes, for example. But also, I think liberals need to have a cultural and a moral voice, right? In order to ask people to engage people in responsibility and civic responsibilities. And so I think coming back to the notion of family, I think what we are often not used to, because our initial idea of the individual is that the individual is autonomous, that it's independent, right? And independence is sort of an ideal to be achieved. And I get that historically, historically, we were entangled and bound up in so many, ties, social ties to others, that it was difficult to become an individual. I think times have changed, right? And we need to restate the importance of relations, right? We need not an individualism that speaks of independence, but we need an individualism that is a relational individualism that speaks of interdependence, not independence. And this interdependence, I think, how to make interdependence, to make that, to align that with freedom. I think that's the challenge. It's a real difficult challenge, because it requires us to go into cultural questions for which liberals have not yet found a good vocabulary for, that we need to renew and rediscover by reading moral philosophy and reading Kant and Krause, as I said, or Dirksmeyer. So that's why I think Dirksmeyer is so important.
So you talked about the cultural understanding of liberalism is important, so that the Western vocabulary isn't, like, people don't really feel part of the Western vocabulary. I mean, in terms of our context in South Asia, things like liberty or libertarianism or liberalism don't really strike a chord with people unless we tell them that, here's this person who is an Indian who lived and he was a liberal. So in that context, how important do you see the values of, people who work within the Islamic idea of liberalism or the Hindu idea of liberalism? How important do you see them as part of shaping this discourse?
Mm-hmm. Very important, decisively important. I think what we need to encourage is learning from one another. And I admit, I'm at the beginning of my quest here. We've been, for the past few years, we've been busy in setting up this inclusive liberalism, one that does not say there's only one way, my way or the highway to Chicago, or the Washington consensus, shall I say, of liberalization. as emancipation. The deregulation alone, has often enslaved people and not freed them, right? So I think liberals need to find a way to be culturally inclusive and learn how to draw a line between what is culture and what is, a sort of a universal agenda that we have, an agenda that is larger than the culture. Because of course we're not just, the child of one culture. I think liberalism belongs to anyone who in his or her heart, feels better by being able to act according to her own understanding of the world. I think everyone who wants to be responsible for her own life is potentially a liberal, probably not, or often not in the political sense yet, but what keeps us back, I wouldn't know. What would keep us back to speak to everyone who wants to live a life that he or she has reason to value, to say it with Sen, to realize that yes, they're in part of the liberal project. I think we have an immense mass appeal, but only if we don't, come along and say, oh, liberalism is exactly what the Chicago school wrote down, or what Hayek wrote down, or Mises, or Friedman, or whatever. And here is the blueprint for deregulation, and that is liberalism. I think what we need to learn is how to see freedom in its many forms, and then by comparing, by holding it up against one another, also learn something about the practice of responsible freedom, and appreciate different ways and forms, and correct each other. Right? We could learn a lot from others. For example, I think Hinduism is a lot more comprehensive in its view of the world than often liberal or Western ideas are. So I think this comprehensive view, this inclusive view of the world, that is something that we should learn from, that we should take up from.
That was an interesting perspective, and we have another question, and it's more like a question that is also part of what we call a way and a way how people perceive certain ideas. For example, self-determination. The question talks about it. But you talked about self-determination, and then you went on
Which
to
kind
talk
of
about
domination?
how
What kind of
self-determination.
Serfdom? Sorry, I can write it to me in the chat, please.
Yeah. Self-determination.
Oh, self-determination. Sorry, I understood domination, and domination is another important. Self-determination. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes. So, how do you feel that self-determination is different from liberation? Because in South Asia, we see this understanding of self-determination to be linked with a political group that wants to determine its political future. So it's mostly linked with liberation movements. But what was interesting in your presentation was how you linked it with an individual.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the difference between liberation and liberal project, for that matter?
Mm-hmm. Well, liberal project, I think the becoming free, right? Shaking off the yoke of others is a first step to learning how to be free. It's a precondition. It's sort of like the outer freedom, but we need an inner freedom too, right? We need to, and that inner freedom doesn't come naturally, right? We need, I think it's a strong part in Hinduism, as I understand it, right? It's about know yourself, right? Perfect yourself, strive to be better, strive to be a person that is has self-mastery, right? And I think that's important if we want to be able to be responsible actors. We need this self-mastery. And I ask all liberals, and maybe we can. I don't know how strong that plays a role in your discussions, but here often, if I start talking about virtue as an idea of how we should strive for personal excellence, people laugh and say that's not a liberal idea. We should not infringe on people and come after them. The way they live, that's their own. Let them self-determine how they want to live, right? But I think self-determination is not just the opportunity to do as you want. It is actually the capability, the competence to use your freedom responsibly, right? And to use it in a way that advances you and others in their respective self-determination and freedom as a way of life.
Thank you so much for that answer. And we have another question from Dennis from India, and he asks that people confuse liberalism with neutral mentality, especially when it comes to politics, which often brings blame on us, that means liberals, for not taking actions. So sort of this question is related to the idea of centrism, of how liberals are seen as the political center and as neutrals and people who don't act. So yeah, what is your opinion on that?
Yeah. Well, I realize I think you had the discussion about 2 or 3 days ago, right, about centrism, and I didn't get around to view the full thing. So I'm sorry if I can relate to that better. I wish I could. It's true that liberals, first of all, I think we belong in the center. I also think that being a centralist is by no means being weak. I think we can be radical centrists, right? And by going back to the roots of being centrist, I think we can be very decisive in what we reject. We don't need to go extremes. I think finding the middle ground is often not only a commonsensical, but it's a prudent move. It's about understanding that it is hard for people to live together if they're different, and that we need to find compromise and common ground, and that compromise is actually something that is human, that makes us, the world is not perfect. We strive to perfect it, we strive to be better, but we can only get better if we don't go at each other's throats, right? If we respect that we're actually different, if we respect that we have different experiences, and then start a conversation about these experiences, I think progress is possible. I mean, I'm very much convinced that we can find a radical centrist progress type. So again, as I said, it's not weak. There is one thing that I think is interesting. We need to learn how to deal with it. That is that as liberals, we are interested in others and open that they might have the truth and not us, right? So as a famous German liberal has said, Karl Hermann Flach, he said, liberalism is a theory of relativity of truth, right? And he said, what we hold true today, yesterday has been an error. And actually, I mean, that's part of the whole, I think, beauty of liberal methods is that they can self-correct, right? That we have feedback mechanisms through price mechanisms, but also through democracy, through talking with one another, so that we can detect our own errors and self-correct. And that makes us hesitant at some times, right? It makes us cautious. It makes and some of us, sort of become conservative, which I regret, right? We shouldn't be conservative. We should be interested in, making the world a better place and in being progressive. And as I said, I think there's an argument to be had for a radical center, a strong radical center.
Interesting. When you talked about the liberals becoming conservatives, sort of conservatives about liberal ideas, which is again a very interesting position to be in. And in that, there's a question which I can relate to this conversation, is that how do you see that the integration of immigrants and this is more a Europe-centric question, in Europe and Germany, and how can liberalism help in that?
Mm-hmm. Let me just dwell a bit on the liberal conservative temptation, shall I say. I think liberals tend to get conservative if we think that the freedoms that actually we ourselves already have are the only freedoms, and we need to defend So if we talk more about protection than promotion, I think we're in the danger of becoming conservatives. There's a place for that, right? Because we do need to protect freedoms. We need to protect them through rights, basically. I don't think we need to protect freedoms that are entrenched, that have become privileges, right? We should always, time and again, go back, and that's the beauty of the democratic open process, that we go back time and again and ask, well, whose freedom are we talking about at the expense of what freedom of others? And as long as we're open to understand that there are freedoms not yet realized by people that we need to begin to realize that they also have freedoms, and that we need to renegotiate, that we need to reconfigure the way we have thought of living free. I think then that's a liberalism that can be creative about itself, that can renew itself, right? And I would hope that liberalism is a constant process of renewal, right? That is never perfect. I like to say I have 3 children, 12, 10, and 7. And I think the work of freedom begins with every young baby, right? With the first cry, right? It begins the project of freedom. But it has something to do with what can liberals do with immigrants or with migration. First of all, I think we need to have better laws for immigration in Germany, at least. And I think it's a European question. We need to regulate it European-wide. We need an understanding of what are conditions for people to be able to come to Europe and live here and become part of even the life in Europe, right? It's one thing to be here for a few years and work. It's another thing to come over and settle and live with us. And so I think we need to define better, the law under which that is possible, but we also need to celebrate a way of life and offer a way of life that people can integrate in, right? So, for example, in Germany, it was a big discussion about, or not a big discussion, but some of my friends had the good idea that they said we should celebrate immigration better. Anytime people actually become German citizens, there ought to be a party, right? Which of course the US has, but we don't have in Germany, right? A sort of a Republican, almost like a Republican with a small r, not with the capital R, right? A Republican Party in the sense that we're happy you're now citizens, right? You've joined the way of life, the way of the public life. And I think that has a lot to do, the law with the culture. We need to understand that we can learn from immigrants, and we can become a better society by being open-minded, not open in the sense of come here and do whatever you would like, but open in the sense of curious, right? That we're curious and that we start a dialogue, that we make people. I think dialogue is a universal language, right? It's freedom practiced for everyone, and if I think it's the most basic human, liberal and human competence is really to be able to be in dialogue. Right? And I think we need to practice that. We need to get a lot better with engaging in dialogue with one another.
Dr. Gohl, tell us a little about the FDP, about how you have kind of spearheaded the liberal movement or the liberal project in Germany, and what were the challenges that you, in your individual position and as a party, faced in Germany?
Thank you. I'm not spearheading anything, not in a meaningful way. At least I'm trying to offer a conversation. But I've been part, indeed, of a change process that we've had. The FDP in the 2000s was sort of for the first time in decades, it had actually gotten into opposition, and it was a time to renew itself. And it did, actually coming up with a lot of good ideas for reforms. The problem was that those reforms during the between 2000 and 2010, many of those reforms were then undertaken by the government. As an opposition party, we were setting the agenda really of reform. So by the time we got to power in 2009, we had no fresh ideas, and we became a party that was against things. Right? We became a party of protection, a conservative party. And while it was important that we had that position and protected certain freedoms. We didn't look out, I think, for certain progressive causes for freedom. Well, we should have gotten stronger. We should have led the way for others in, homosexuality, or legalizing, homosexual relationships, that sort of thing. For example, there's also others. It's about leading the way in digitization, something that we've then taken up later on. Also, I think we should have led the way in ecological terms, right? Offer viable ways to protect the environment through liberal means, right? And making liberalism the driver really of, well, in this case, ecological responsibility. I mean, I think liberalism is a driver of responsibility, right? If we don't misunderstand it as a cheap individualism, as an excuse to be greedy, as an excuse to be an egoist, right? We understand liberalism as a project to, create conditions of human flourishing. Of course, ecological responsibility is part of the project. So I wish we would have fought for that, and we realigned, and actually we did take up some of the issues, some of the ideas, until 2017, when we got back into parliament. It was quite a struggle, being from out of parliament and then coming back in, at least on a national level. It was very hard for us, but we achieved it, I think, with a better liberalism, a more progressive-minded liberalism. The danger is always that we are not forgotten in a public that is polarized, in a public that is diverse, political public. There were 6 parties in parliament. I don't know whether that's many or not, but it's certainly a lot more than we used to have. It's hard to distinguish oneself, and so we often focus on, let's say, a caricature of ourselves, right? Because that's, at least people, recognize the caricature, but it doesn't serve us well, and so we're struggling. And I think, even though I think we need to be more a party of ideas. We need to have more reform concepts, especially now for climate change, of course, but also for democracy, right? We need to lead the debate on how to reform liberal democracy, make democracy great again for the 21st century, right? And realize how that works with digital publics. And as I think we need to come back to understand a lot more on our end, right? Or others, other thinkers that have been before us, some of which are laid out before.
Yeah, that brings me to the final question. And from this conversation, what I could gauge and understand, and correct me if I'm mistaken, is you see liberalism as a way of life rather than just a political or an economic idea. And in that conversation, you also talked about your view of, how do I put it, civil rights and civil liberties, where you talked that the FDP could have done more and or could have kind of refurnished its position on that. Uh, there's a similar crisis that we face in our part of the world, in India, where the question of civil liberties is increasingly becoming important. And although we have a robust constitutional mechanism that does grant civil liberty as fundamental rights, but we also see that within the general population, we're not seeing that much of an excitement about this idea. So how do you solve this problem, where you actually have a very good law, but you are not able to trickle down those cultural sort of ideas of freedom within the general population?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, and I won't pretend I have a final answer, but my intuition would be that first of all, it has something to do with liberalism being a way of life or not. And let me correct myself or you. I don't know, maybe when I said it's a way of life, I think it's a public way of life, right? It's a citizen's way of life. I don't think it's a private way of life. And of course, the two, there's a continuity between private and public life, right? So let's say as a liberal, I'm concerned with certain aspects of your way of life, and that's the public aspect, and not your private one. I think if we can build those bridge sides, Brückenköpfe, what is that? The bridgeheads, I think it's a bridgehead, right? So the bridgehead between what, as liberals, we would ask and require of you as a citizen with all your rights and also your responsibilities, and your private life. And we can sort of create a continuity between where people with, the religious convictions, their moral convictions, can find themselves part of liberalism and not think that liberals are, like us, younger men, in my case, young men in your case, right? Living in a city, well educated, right? The urban class, the urban elites, right? So I think we're not benefiting, even though, that is the realistic take on liberalism. It is also somewhat class driven. I'm saying this very carefully here because people think that, bring back Marxian categories, but of course, we're more of a bourgeois project, right? So, and I think we need to be a little bit more citoyen. We need to be more inclusive. We need to be able to be more moral, more religious, but not without, losing our sight as liberals. So it comes back to being able to have that dialogue where we build those bridges, or the between the bridgeheads, right? The continuity between the private and the public life. And again, what you do in your private life, as long as you're a good citizen, that is important. And what that entails, I think, is for any society to determine in dialogue, which is why public freedom, political freedom is so important to me.
Building bridges is a wonderful note to kind of end this conversation, to conclude this conversation, at least for today. And it is a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Gohl. And we at Swatantrata Center in India, we appreciate the work that you are doing individually, FDP is doing as an organization, and then FNF, organizations like FNF in Germany, who are doing it internationally. So we really appreciate and we value your commitment, and it inspires us to work out ways within our own traditional and indigenous sort of ideas of how to make a liberal society. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Anas. I'm very thankful for being able to have had the opportunity for this conversation. I hope that others and more will follow. I recommended the book to you. I will also write it into the YouTube channel once it's there, so people can find it there. Thank you again. Thank you to anyone with questions and to everyone who was present, and for your interest. And I wish you a great day and a great future for liberalism in India. And I'm looking forward to visiting it one day.
Thank you so much. We look forward to hosting you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.